The rain hammered against the cracked pavement of the flea market, creating a rhythmic, deafening drumbeat that seemed to echo the anxious pounding of Alera's heart. She wasn't supposed to be there. The market was closed, the vendors had packed up hours ago, and the security guards were doing their final rounds. Yet, something invisible and magnetic pulled her toward the far corner of the lot, where a single dust-covered object sat isolated under a flickering street lamp. It was a mirror, framed in dark, twisted with that looked like burnt bones, with glass that seemed to swirl with a murky, gray fog rather than reflecting the wet asphalt around it. Alera felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine, a primal warning signal screaming at her to run, to leave this cursed place immediately. But her feet moved on their own, drawn by a hypnotic allure she couldn't explain. As she reached out, her fingers brushed the cold, ornate frame, and for a split second, she swore she saw a face in the glass that wasn't hers, a face filled with infinite sorrow and malicious intent. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and old decay, as if the mirror itself was breathing. She bought it from a shadowy figure who appeared out of nowhere, taking her money with trembling, ice-cold hands, whispering words in a language she didn't understand before vanishing into the mist. Carrying the mirror into her small, cramped apartment felt like dragging a corpse across the threshold, a heavy, oppressive weight that made her arms ache and her breath come in short, shallow gasps. The hallway lights flickered violently as she passed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at her ankles, trying to pull her back into the darkness she had just escaped. She struggled to maneuver the bulky object through her narrow doorframe, the wood scraping against the paint with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, a screech that set her teeth on edge and made her skin crawl. Once inside, she leaned it against the wall in her bedroom, the only place large enough to accommodate its imposing presence. The room instantly felt colder, the temperature dropping several degrees in a matter of seconds, causing her breath to form visible clouds in the dim light. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the market, but the silence in the room was too absolute, too suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a predatory silence, waiting for her to make a mistake. She covered the mirror with an old bedsheet, unable to bear the sight of that swirling gray fog any longer, and retreated to her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide open, staring at the lump under the sheet as if it were a sleeping beast waiting to wake. Sleep did not come easily that night. It hovered on the edges of her consciousness, elusive and fragile, constantly shattered by the slightest creak of the old building or the distant wail of the siren. Alera lay rigid in her bed, every muscle tensed, listening to the rhythm of her own heartbeat, which sounded like a war drum in the silent room. The covered mirror stood in the corner like a sentinel, a silent judge watching her every move, even though it was draped in fabric. She could feel its presence, a malevolent energy radiating from behind the sheet, pressing against her mind like a physical weight. Around 2 a.m., the wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the window frames, sounding eerily like human voices whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. She pulled the duvet over her head, trying to block out the sounds, but the whispers seemed to penetrate the fabric, growing louder and more distinct. They weren't speaking English. They were speaking in guttural clicks and hisses, a language of pure hatred. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, freezing the sweat on her forehead. She peeked out from under the covers, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, and saw that the sheet covering the mirror had slipped slightly, revealing a sliver of the glass. In that tiny reflection, she saw not her bed, but a dark, endless void, and for a second, she thought she saw two red eyes blinking back at her from the abyss. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Alera, going through the motions of her daily life like a zombie, her mind consumed by the dread of returning home. She tried to ignore the mirror, pretending it didn't exist, but the air in her apartment remained stale and cold, no matter how many windows she opened or how high she turned up the heater. Colleagues noticed her pale complexion and the dark circles under her eyes, asking if she was sick, but she couldn't explain the terror that gripped her every time she crossed the threshold of her front door. She started sleeping with the lights on, all of them, leaving no corner of the apartment in shadow, yet the feeling of being watched never left her. It was on the third night that the pattern established itself. Alara screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore from her throat, but no sound came out. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, silencing her completely. She scrambled backward, pushing herself against the headboard, her eyes locked on the terrifying image in the glass. The reflection remained lying down, its chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic breathing that contrasted sharply with Alara's hyperventilation. It was a violation of natural law, a glitch in reality that made her stomach churn with nausea. She blinked rapidly, hoping it was a hallucination, a trick of the light. But when she opened her eyes, the scene remained unchanged. The reflection's eyes followed her movements now, tracking her fear with a predatory interest. Slowly, agonizingly, the figure in the mirror began to sit up, mirroring Alara's current position, but with a delay, as if it were mocking her, playing with her. The movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by an inexperienced hand. Alara tried to look away, to break the eye contact, but her neck muscles refused to obey, frozen in place by an invisible force. She realized with dawning horror that she was trapped in a game she didn't understand, bound by rules written in blood and shadow. The reflection tilted its head, a gesture of curiosity that looked grotesque on its pale, featureless face, and then it smiled. A thin, cruel curve of lips that promised pain. The days that followed were a descent into madness, Alara barely functioning, her mind fracturing under the strain of constant surveillance. She stopped going to work, calling in sick with a voice that sounded hollow and distant, unable to articulate the true nature of her affliction. She covered the mirror again, this time with multiple layers of blankets, tape, and even cardboard, sealing it tightly as if containing a radioactive leak. But the coverage didn't stop the feelings. If anything, it amplified them. She could hear scratching sounds coming from behind the layers, faint at first, then growing louder like fingernails dragging across glass. She spent her hours wandering the apartment, jumping at every shadow, her nerves frayed to the point of breaking. She stopped eating, surviving on water and adrenaline, her body wasting away, becoming a shell of the person she used to be. Friends stopped calling, worried by her silence, but she couldn't answer. She was too busy listening to the whispers that now permeated every room, not just the bedroom. They told her to come closer, to look, to join them. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was a portal, a gateway to a dimension of pure malice, and it was hungry. Alara found herself standing in front of the covered mass for hours, transfixed, fighting the urge to tear away the bindings. The struggle was internal, a war between her survival instinct and a dark, seductive pull that promised an end to her fear, if only she would surrender. Desperation drove Alara to seek answers, leading her to the dusty archives of the local library and the obscure corners of the internet. She searched for the history of the flea market, the vendor, and specifically, the mirror. What she found was chilling. The market had been built on the site of an old asylum that burned down in the 1950s, a fire that claimed the lives of dozens of patients and staff. Rumors persisted that the head doctor, a man obsessed with the concept of the soul and its reflection, had conducted unethical experiments on his patients, trying to trap their spirits in mirrors. One particular mirror, described as having a frame of burnt bone, was said to be the centerpiece of his rituals, a vessel for the most tormented souls. Alara's blood ran cold as she read the descriptions. They matched her mirror perfectly. There were accounts of previous owners going mad, committing suicide, or disappearing without a trace, all after purchasing the same antique. She found a forum thread from 10 years ago where a user claimed to have seen their reflection move independently, ending with a post that simply said, "It's here now," followed by silence. The digital trail went cold, but the implication was clear. The mirror didn't just reflect, it consumed. It fed on fear and isolation, growing stronger with every night that passed. Alara realized she wasn't just haunted. She was being digested, her sanity chewed up and swallowed by the entity trapped within the glass. Armed with this knowledge, Alara should have felt empowered, but instead, she felt a crushing sense of inevitability. Knowing the origin of the curse didn't break it. It only confirmed that there was no escape. That night, she decided to stay awake, armed with a hammer and a bottle of holy water she had bought from a nearby church, though she wasn't sure if faith would work on something so ancient and evil. She sat in a chair facing the mirror, the covers removed, staring into the glass with defiant eyes. The clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., each second stretching into an eternity. At 2:59, the lights in the apartment flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. The mirror began to glow with a faint, eerie luminescence, the gray fog inside swirling faster, forming shapes that looked like screaming faces. Alara gripped the hammer, her knuckles white, ready to strike. But as the clock struck 3, the reflection appeared. It wasn't her this time. It was a grotesque distortion, an amalgamation of twisted limbs and gaping mouths, pressing against the glass from the inside. The glass didn't break. It bent, stretching like elastic, bulging outward toward her. The holy water spilled from her hand, useless, as the entity laughed, a sound that vibrated in her bones, shattering her resolve. The bulge in the glass grew larger, taking on a humanoid shape, hands pressing against the surface, fingers elongating and sharpening into claws. Alara scrambled back, knocking over the chair, her scream finally finding its voice, a shrill cry of pure terror that echoed through the empty apartment. The entity in the mirror mimicked her fear, its face twisting into a mask of agony and delight. It wanted her to run. It wanted her to panic. The air in the room became toxic, thick with the smell of sulfur and rotting flesh, making it hard to breathe. Alara coughed, her lungs burning, as she crawled toward the door, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The glass began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading from the points where the claws pressed, but no shards fell. Instead, a black, viscous liquid began to seep through the cracks, dripping onto the floor with a hiss. Where the liquid touched the wooden floorboards, they smoked and charred, eating away at the material. The entity was leaking into her world, bridging the gap between reflection and reality. Alara reached the door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the key. Behind her, the sound of cracking glass intensified, accompanied by a wet, tearing sound, like meat being ripped apart. She knew that once that door opened, she might not be able to close it again, but staying meant death. Just as Alara turned the key, the door slammed shut with a force that threw her backward, pinning her against the wall. The lock clicked into place, not by her hand, but by an invisible force. She was trapped. The mirror stood at the other end of the room, the black liquid now forming a pool that spread rapidly across the floor, reaching for her feet. The entity had fully emerged from the glass, standing tall and gaunt, its skin translucent and gray, revealing the dark veins pulsing beneath. It had no eyes, only empty sockets that seemed to suck the light from the room. It moved toward her, not walking, but gliding, its feet not touching the ground. Alara tried to scream, to beg, but her voice was gone, stolen by the oppressive silence that had returned. The creature raised a hand, long fingers reaching for her face, and she felt a coldness so intense it burned her skin. She closed her eyes, expecting the end, but instead, she felt a whisper in her mind, not in her ears. "You are mine," it said, the voice echoing in her skull. "You have looked too long. You have seen too much. Now, you will become part of the collection." She realized then that the mirror wasn't just a prison for the ghost. It was a factory, and she was the next product. Her body began to feel heavy, her limbs turning to stone, as she was pulled inexorably toward the glass. As Alara was dragged across the floor, her nails scraping against the wood, leaving trails of blood, she fought with every ounce of strength remaining in her deteriorating body. She kicked out, her foot connecting with the creature's shin, but it felt like kicking a block of ice, numb and unyielding. The creature didn't flinch. It merely tightened its grip on her soul, pulling her closer to the shimmering surface of the mirror. Inside the glass, she saw other faces, dozens of them, pressed against the inner surface, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with eternal terror. They were the previous victims, the collected souls, watching her join their ranks. One face, a young girl with braided hair, reached out, her hand pressing against the glass from the inside, mirroring the action Alara had seen nights before. It was a warning, or perhaps a plea for help. Alara focused on that face, using it as an anchor to her humanity, refusing to let go of her identity. She recited her name over and over. I am Alara, I am Alara, building a mental barrier against the invading darkness. The creature hissed, frustrated by her resistance, its form flickering and destabilizing. The pull weakened slightly, giving her a momentary reprieve. She grabbed the leg of the heavy oak dresser nearby, anchoring herself, stopping her slide toward the abyss. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure rage that shattered the remaining windows in the apartment, sending shards of glass raining down on them. The wind howled into the room, carrying with it the scent of rain and freedom, but also chaos. Alara used the distraction to lunge forward, not away from the mirror, but toward it. She grabbed the hammer she had dropped earlier, raising it high above her head. The creature, surprised by her aggression, hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. With a cry that combined fear and fury, she brought the hammer down on the center of the mirror. The impact was explosive, a burst of black energy that threw her backward. The glass didn't just break. It exploded outward, shards flying like shrapnel, cutting into her skin. But instead of falling to the floor, the shards hung in the air, suspended in time, each piece reflecting a different moment of her life, a different fear, a different regret. The creature dissolved into smoke, its form unraveling, but the mirror's power wasn't gone. The floating shards began to rotate, forming a vortex of glass and memory. Alara lay on the floor, bleeding and broken, watching as the vortex spun faster, pulling the air, the light, and her very essence into its center. She had broken the vessel, but she had released the curse. Silence returned, heavier than before, as the vortex collapsed in on itself, imploding with a sound like a vacuum seal breaking. The shards of glass fell to the floor, ordinary and dull, no longer glowing or moving. Alara lay there for what felt like hours, unable to move, her body bruised and cut, her mind reeling from the trauma. The apartment was destroyed, windows blown out, furniture overturned, but the oppressive cold was gone. The air felt normal, stale, but safe. She slowly pushed herself up, wincing in pain, and looked at the pile of glass where the mirror had been. There was no frame, no magic, just debris. She laughed, a dry, hacking sound, tears streaming down her face. She had survived. She had won. But as she stood up, shaky and weak, she caught her reflection in a shard of glass on the floor. She froze. The reflection didn't mimic her movement. It stood still while she trembled. And then it smiled. Not the wicked smile of the creature, but her own smile, twisted and wrong. She realized with horror that the mirror hadn't been destroyed, it had been scattered, and every piece held a fragment of the entity. She was free from the main vessel, but she was now surrounded by thousands of tiny mirrors, each one a potential doorway. Alara spent the next week cleaning up the apartment, wearing gloves and long sleeves, avoiding looking at any reflective surface. She swept up every speck of glass, bagging it and throwing it in the dumpster outside, ensuring none remained. She covered the windows with newspaper, blocked the bathroom mirror with paint, and removed all metallic objects that could show a reflection. She lived in a world of matte finishes and soft fabrics, afraid of her own image. But the paranoia grew. She felt eyes on her everywhere. In the spoon she used to eat soup, she saw a distorted face. In the dark screen of her television, she saw a shadow move. In the puddle of rain on the street, she saw herself waving when she was standing still. The entity was fragmented, yes, but it was also omnipresent. It was in every reflection, waiting for her to look, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She stopped sleeping, afraid of dreaming, afraid of the dark. She wandered the streets at night, avoiding mirrors and shop windows, keeping her head down. People stared at her, thinking she was homeless or insane, but she didn't care. She was hunting the reflections, trying to destroy them all, but it was an impossible task. The world was full of mirrors, and she was alone in her fight. Months passed, and Alara became a ghost in her own life, hiding from the world, hiding from herself. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and lived in a basement apartment with no windows and no mirrors. She thought she was safe. She thought she had escaped. But one evening, while washing her face in the sink, she paused. The water was still, a perfect, dark mirror. She looked down, expecting to see her tired, haggard face. Instead, she saw nothing. The water reflected the ceiling, the light bulb, the pipes, but not her. She touched her face, feeling her skin, her nose, her lips, but the water showed no touch, no ripple. She panicked, splashing water, but the reflection remained empty. Then, a voice came from the drain, gurgling and wet. "You didn't escape, Alara," it whispered. "You just changed the container." She looked up, and in the dark, wet tiles of the bathroom wall, she saw her reflection staring back, smiling that wicked, familiar smile. She realized then that she hadn't broken the curse. She had become it. She was no longer the viewer. She was the viewed. And somewhere, in a flea market in another city, a new mirror was waiting for its next victim. And Alara was now part of the glass, forever trapped, forever watching, forever hungry.